Good evening and a very warm welcome to all. Thank you for joining us this evening for the first ever live debate hosted by the Chennai Center for China Studies. On the 15th September 2021, US President Joe Biden was virtually joined by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison as they made a joint televised address at the White House. The subject of their address was the announcement of a new security trilateral alliance called AUKUS. Under this alliance, the three nations have agreed to enhance the development of joint capabilities and technology sharing, fostering deep integration of security, industrial bases, and supply chains. The first major initiative under AUKUS would support Australia in building a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines with the aim of promoting stability in the Indo-Pacific as a counter to China's increasingly assertive actions in the region. The announcement was met with a flurry of dramatic reactions from across the globe. France, in particular, has been especially critical of the pact, as Australia abandoned a 43 billion USD deal to build French conventional submarines in favor of the new pact. China has lashed out at what it calls a Cold War mentality, denouncing the pact as irresponsible and provoking an arms race in the Indo-Pacific. Southeast Asian nations have had largely ambivalent reactions. What impact will the AUKUS have on the future of security in the Indo-Pacific? What are its implications on pre-existing regional alliances, such as the Quad and ASEAN? What does India stand to gain or lose from an Anglo alliance in its backyard? To answer these questions and more, we have a panel of in-house experts to give us a 360-degree perspective on AUKUS and the prognosis of developments in the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. Before we get into the debate, I'd like to invite my colleague, Mr. Balasubramanian, Research Officer at C3S, to introduce our panelists. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Nisha, for set the ball rolling. It is indeed a great privilege and honor for me to warmly welcome four distinguished panelists from Chennai Center for China Studies. And it is also a great privilege and honor for me to warmly welcome all the distinguished participants who have taken their time out to be with us. I request all the participants to please post your questions in the chat box. It will be taken up only from the chat box. Now, I would like to warmly welcome. First, to begin with, our first distinguished panelist is Commodore R.S. Basan, Director General, Chennai Center for China Studies. Commodore Vijesh Kumar Garg, Executive Director, Chennai Center for China Studies. Commodore Venugopal Menon, Distinguished Member, C3S. And Shri Sridharan Subramaniam, Sir, Distinguished Member, C3S. Thank you very much, sir, for taking your time out to be with us here today. Now, I would like to, we all have a lot of questions that is to be answered. And I'm sure you also have your views ready. First, I would like to let it to Nisha to start with the first question.
Thank you, sir. Since the announcement of the AUKUS Security Pact, there has been extensive discussion in international fora about the sudden nature of the announcement, its unspoken but strong messaging to China, and its implications on the countries that inhabit the Indo-Pacific. Commodore Basan, what are your views on the timing of this announcement? What strategic significance does it hold against the backdrop of events that have unfolded on the world stage in the recent past?
Thank you, Nisha. First of all, I would like to compliment the research team of C3S for putting this program together. It's not that we've not had live debates before, but it's the first time that the in-house expertise is being used to address a very serious issue as it is developing. So let me compliment the young team of C3S for putting this program together, both with a view to educate the participants as well as to have a clear vision of what we need to do as India and what we need to do as a think tank to put up these analysis of these discussions and also the way forward for the policymakers. That is the way I look at this program. So I would definitely encourage all the participants to pose very uncomfortable questions. In fact, my first directive to the research team was, I said, please pose questions which makes us squirm and we are very uncomfortable in our seat, because that's the only way we can bring out the true nature of discussions. So coming to your specific point, this is a very important development, not foreseen at all. I would say that nobody expected this triangular coalition to be announced as such, and as many analysts have agreed, while it caused waves in the Indo-Pacific, it caused ripples in the Atlantic. Because you saw how France has reacted, and it is it's obviously something to do with the kind of money that was committed to the conventional submarine project, and where Australia was supposed to build 12 of these. It's not that it was going to happen tomorrow. That was also going to be happening around 2025. And suddenly France finds that, the money of 50 to 60 billion dollars that it would have got in the next 10 to 15 years by, constructing these 12 submarines with conventional capability has suddenly come to naught. And you find that US and UK, this group has suddenly come in here and has become more relevant. So, you need to look at this not in terms military terms, which definitely is an important factor by way of countering China, but also in terms of sustaining the military industrial complex of US and UK. Because it's been clearly brought out that since 1958, the technology that we are talking about on these nuclear submarines, these are SSNs. That basically the difference is that the SSBNs carry the missiles, whereas the SSNs will only have a long range. That means they have sustained long ranges, what we call in the Navy as long legs, and they also have a bigger loiter time. So now what's happened is that USA is going to share this technology with Australia for the first time. So that's happening after 1958. And therefore, there are questions here as far as China is concerned on how is it going to look at these emerging new threats that it's going to face in the Indo-Pacific. So the timing, as far as timing is concerned, it could be a sheer coincidence that it's happened before the Quad. But today, all the four leaders have allayed any fears about whether the Quad will succeed or not succeed. So Quad has a different trajectory. The AUKUS has a different trajectory altogether. But I'm sure we will subsequently discuss on the kind of implications that it has for India, because this is something, in my personal opinion, and also the professional assessment, is that it gives India a lot more breathing space, because China will need to counter a threat that has emerged there. It's not that it's happening tomorrow. Even the nuclear submarines that we are talking about will come only in next decade plus. So, but it is a threat in being, and China would need to start worrying about what their deployment patterns are, and now what will this lead to in addition to the Quad, which has a different connotation, which I'm sure we'll have some questions on that when we'll discuss this later. So coming back to the centrality of AUKUS, it's an important triangular formation of these three countries. UK, which was nowhere in the picture in the Indo-Pacific, has suddenly become relevant. And it's for the first time it sailed a carrier into the South China Sea to pursue the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. And with this confluence of US, UK, and Australia, again, who all have a common flag, which they served earlier perhaps, they would be in a position to pose substantial challenge in the maritime domain, in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, there are benefits which India can reap, of which I would like to discuss later, because I would not like to answer all the questions right now. So hope, Nisha, that answers some part of your questions about the AUKUS, but I'm sure there'll be more questions both from the audience and from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. You have very beautifully answered what was the rationale behind this AUKUS Pact. I would like to pose a question to Commodore Menon. Commodore Menon, as you can see, the three nations of the AUKUS, they are already allied to each other in more than one way. For example, the United States, the UK are already NATO allies. You can also find the Australia, New Zealand, and the US, they signed a pact in 1951, which is the ANZUS Pact. And all three are also, they are also a part of the Five Eyes Alliance, which is a base of an arrangement of intelligence alliance. In such a scenario, Commodore Menon, do you think this announcement places a question mark over the relevance of this forum, as already you can see the Quad for the Indo-Pacific is already creating a geostrategic space? it has also now brought into greater scrutiny the relevance of Quad 2. How do you see this, Commodore Menon?
Well, this question has put the analyst into a tiffy over the last 3 days, as I can see, and the news channels are fully geared up. I mean, fully on an overdrive, trying to find the rationale. And surprisingly, I found very little coverage of the entire event in CNN or in Fox News. That notwithstanding, I'll answer your question in 4 parts. Firstly, as you said rightly, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and US are military allies by nature. Now, coming on to answers, that is Australia, New Zealand, Australia agreement, which was signed in 1951, was basically a collective security non-binding agreement between the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Aim was to reassure the two countries, that is New Zealand and Australia, that they would be protected and supported as an anti-communist cause. Predominantly a Cold War arrangement. This treaty has not been abrogated as yet. However, the United States and New Zealand does not maintain security relationship, although US maintains that New Zealand is a major non-NATO ally. Moving on to Five Eyes is basically an intelligence sharing pact between the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, which is a signal intelligence sharing alliance, again aimed at keeping a track of communications from the communist bloc of the Cold War era. Now we come to the AUKUS. As you all know, as Commodore Vasan has clearly amplified about the importance of AUKUS in the current scenario, this pact basically is a security pact, which is most important point to note, unlike Quad. And this pact is aimed at a very strong military alliance between the three countries, that the US, UK, and Australia, even extending the defense cooperation to sharing of nuclear technology, which was never heard of earlier. Both US and UK are supposed to assist the building of assistance. This pact will also increase the level of exchange between the three armed forces, three militaries, increase the number of military assets in Australia, increase the number of personnel posted in Australia, defense personnel I'm referring to, and even it will go on to the Americans operating their nuclear powered carriers from Australia. In a nutshell, Australia would become a major military ally for the US Indo-Pacific region as a center of gravity. Now coming on to the next way, comparing this with Quad. Whereas Quad has a much broader vision, which includes, amongst many, the response to COVID, vaccine diplomacy, science and technology cooperation, tackling climate change, cooperation in critical and emerging technologies, cyber technology, HADR response, supply chain management post-COVID, to name a few. However, in the joint statement released yesterday, after the summit meeting of Quad leaders, it also included coordination of diplomatic, economic, and human rights policies in Afghanistan. Please note, Afghanistan is not part of Indo-Pacific region. That is what is surprising me most. As far as security dimension is concerned, Quad aims at promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific to bolster security and prosperity and rule of law. I'm sure this, all of you must have heard it an umpteen number of times from various sources. So it is more of a general statement, which is aimed at no country in particular. Also, another way, if you look at North Korea was mentioned in the joint statement of yesterday. So in short, Quad has security element which remains hidden between the lines, without actually explicitly stating it. So, in my view, I would see Quad more as a soft power related alliance in the Indo-Pacific region, whereas AUKUS is focusing more on hard power. And in a way, if we look holistically, both should complement each other with an overall strategic aim of containing China. Thank you. I hope I have answered this question.
Thank you. Thank you, Commodore Menon. I would like to ask to Commodore Vasan, uh, uh, looking at the responses of Commodore Menon, what we can see is that in the joint statement, we have had about cyber security, we have had everything, even including North Korea and Afghanistan, except they have not named China. Now, again, this brings back the question, the relevance of Quad into greatest community. Would you like to, respond to that, Commodore Vasan?
Yeah, I think it's very obvious. Just before the meeting started, we had a brief discussion on this issue of why China was not mentioned. This is where there was a difference. Apparently, one of the panelists yesterday said this is the difference between bureaucracy and diplomacy. So, all this is about diplomacy. You don't name and shame people in diplomatic forums. What you do is send out those messages, and they start reading between the lines, and they get the message that is intended. So I am sure that China has got all the message, without even being named, to say that both the Quad as well as the AUKUS are part of an architecture that will corner China. It is very, very worried. If China was not worried, why would it go around, into a small country like Bangladesh and say, don't join the Quad? Bangladesh had not even been invited. Ditto about the recent statement to say that the Quad will fail. These are, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride them. The Quad has, as Venu also has brought out, has expanded the scope beyond the military realm. We are looking at vaccine, we are looking at cooperation. Another important statement that was made was that there would be, US will support, educational postings of people in higher institutions of science technology. That's an important development. So there are a lot of takeaways when you look at what Quad is offering. Initially, when the Quad was instituted, there were doubts in minds of everybody to say, what about Quad? What will it do? Etc., etc. At that time, even within CPS, we had intense debates, some for, some against. It doesn't matter. That's how I think time grows. We are quite clear that we should not be looking at what the Quad cannot do. We should look at what the potentials there are for Quad to go on a different trajectory that will corner China. So both are complementary. Whether it's Quad and whether it's AUKUS today, you find that there is a complementary role. One takes on the military task, the other takes on the software dimensions, as Venu also has highlighted. So I would look at this as, in the statement, just because the China is not mentioned, it does not mean it is not targeting China. On the contrary, China should be very concerned that it's not been named. So what is the message that you are trying to send? The message is very clear. Look, we know what you are doing in South China Sea. We know what you are doing in East China Sea. We know how you are bullying your neighbors out there. In fact, it is China which has to be blamed for pushing Australia into a corner by applying economic pressure, by applying political pressure, by applying diplomatic pressure. They virtually pushed a reluctant country like Australia, which was hesitant to join the Quad, into a corner which has firmed up its position. Who do you blame for this? Not Australia. They have tried to apply economic pressure. The same thing happened in the case of the other three partners, but the other three partners by and large were quite clear, whether it is with the Malabar exercises or whether it is with the exercises conducted off Guam, that they are quite clear that they will join hands. It was only Australia which was always reluctant. I would also like to draw the attention of the audience here to a white paper that was made out by Australia in 2016. Please go through that. The defense white paper of 2016, where they are quite clear about what they want to achieve in the maritime domain. There is no mention of China. They always have been talking about a harmonized relation between US and China. So, having read that particular document, China should have been wiser to manage the relations with Australia. So it is in Hindi, they say, apne पैरों पे कुल्हाड़ी मारना. So this is exactly what it has done. For the others who are not familiar with Hindi, it's basically taking an axe and hitting on your own feet. So this is what China has done, and therefore I'm quite convinced that the messages that were sought to be read by Wang Yi have been read. He's read through the lines and is very concerned, and I'm sure that it has created ripples within the Chinese Communist Party, of which we'll talk about later. Hope that answers why China was not mentioned in any of these missives that have been issued. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a very comprehensive answer on the differences between the Quad and the AUKUS Pact. And moving on, so there have been very dramatic reactions and very violent ones from Southeast Asian nations since the announcement of the pact. Commodore Vijesh, according to you, what impact will this alliance have on the maritime landscape in the Indo-Pacific region? Do you see other Southeast Asian nations shoring up their own maritime defense and nuclear capabilities as a measure of precaution? Sir, your mic is muted, sir.
Before me, Commodore Venu and Vasan sir already explained the bigger your South Asian countries. Now you see, I want to answer this question in 3 parts. First is the US gameplay. Every nation has its own interest, economic interest and strategic interest. Okay, and I look this whole your issue of not Quad or AUKUS in a very different perspective. In Second World War, it was the rise of Japan, which US put it down on a very harsh way. It was the Cold War era, but the Russians were competing with them. The competitor had to be broken down in a very different way. Now it is the China, which US want to contain because it's becoming bigger in size, economically and as well as technically and militarily challenging to US. That is US interest is there now. Now, what is the strength of China is the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific. Who are the major players in this area? China, India, Australia is not a bigger player so far. You have South Korea, very capable. You have Singapore, very neutral. You have Malaysia, not speaking. Indonesia is speaking about it. And China has boundaries, whether it's a 7-dash line or the island disputes from Japan downwards till Indonesia, small islands there. They got conflict with everybody else. But now we talk about AUKUS. But today, the Taiwan issue is there, which Japan is there, and US has guaranteed to do that. But as China is growing in the South China Sea, which is part of Indo-Pacific, this new development giving nukes or assistance to Australia, this new deal, how we offset the whole system. First, economic aspect. Now, in military hardware market or technological market, there's only very few players. Either France, the US, either Russia, or to Germany to some extent. Because submarines are concerned. Correct? It is the US interest as well. The US interest as well. If France is getting submarine contract from them, France is giving submarine to India now, Scorpion contract with them, correct? It is budget interest, economic interest, economic strategic interest. Second, there have been delays in this whole contract, the cost escalations, which they took advantage. It's not that at all, many experts have said intelligence failure everywhere. The deal has been done very abruptly. It's not happened overnight. They knew about it. But what happens now? When nuclear submarine coming to Australia, it will take 2035, 40 to come first submarine, because US will not give. US is only giving the fuel. The technology is coming from UK to make it. US has not given this technology to anybody till now. And India has been a part of apartheid for so long. and it takes Indian submarine program, which we have nuclear submarine now. It started 83. 98 the construction started, and we got submarine very recently now. It's a huge time lag. As Commodore Watson says, it's not coming tomorrow. But how upset? What will happen? US or UK will start operating their new SSN for Australia now. It's a base there now, because infrastructure is going to come. And once you have this, then the new craze starts in the area. A nuclear submarine in an ocean like this is the biggest or the biggest asset for sea denial. Remember Falkland War? One nuclear submarine put the whole Argentine fleet inside the harbor. Then the threat you have. So this is what the game is being played now. To contain China, which is roaming around the whole South Pacific or towards the Western Pacific now. And this exercise in Malabar, which happened this year in the Western Pacific, was a message to them. It's a message to them. British carrier, you knew Elizabeth sailing all the way, coming to India, private Indian Navy, then going to Malaysian Navy, then Singapore Navy, then Japan, conveying the message to China that seas are open for everybody now. So a Quad message, free, open seas to everybody. So these are the messages being conveyed in the landscape. When you look at it here, the ASEAN country themselves are not one voice. This has come out very clearly now. The Singapore is praising the AUKUS. They're very happy about it. The Philippines are happy about it. Taiwan's very happy about it because US is guaranteed for them. But Indonesia is making a noise. India, of course, India is a power itself. India doesn't need anybody's help. India can make own submarines now. We have our own program. So India is not making a noise. We are watching it. We are a bigger player here. We have nothing to lose, nothing to gain in Australia against a nuclear submarine. We have our own. They'll take 30 years to get it. We have, by the time, India may have third submarine also. Hope and pray we have. Coming to the one major player which is left in the whole discussion is the South Korea. Just before now, I look at the analysis. This whole thing has come because North Korea fired the ballistic missiles just before the Quad was, this AUKUS was announced, and South Korea submarine fired a 500-kilometer range missile. China and Koreans have a very cozy relationship at time comes. It's known to them also. So in my personal view or analysis, you see the timings, this is what is actually put this AUKUS in a sudden hurry, that there's something should be there to counter it if time comes. It's not that US submarines are not roaming around there. They are there, they have huge endurance, they have huge fleet with them, but you need some base. Australia is the biggest base for them, and this will change the whole. Say that we look at the maritime scape, a nuclear operation going around. The Indian Navy was one. There's nobody else. Other than the US, UK, French, who was operating a nuclear submarine there. But now we will have a nuclear base which is roaming around there. And it's a big deterrent. The sea denial measures which the AUKUS is putting against so-called, not saying it as Commodore Watson said, the diplomacy, but against whom we know is against the China. So he got dispute with everybody how to put him in place. This way, maybe this is the biggest change I see of this development right now.
Thank you, Commodore Garg. Much is now being spoken about the AUKUS, the South Asian region. I have a question for Mr. Sridharan. Let me take you, Mr. Sridharan, to a little bit to Europe. There are some beliefs among geopolitical observers. They say that about the Anglosphere nations, all those countries which share a cultural and historical ties to the UK, they say they inspire more confidence in each other. But however, now we find the inclusion of UK, the United Kingdom, in the AUKUS post-Brexit, which we see in a very much diminished stage of the UK in such a very long-range alliance. And it has also, in some quarters, it has also raised some eyebrows. How do you see this, Mr. Sridharan?
Thank you, Bala, for asking that question. See, it is natural that the so-called Anglosphere nations have an affinity. They trace the same ancestry. Both US and Australia are British settlements. The US and the UK are joined in the hips. That's what everybody says. And they have a very special relationship for a very, very long time. Besides, they have taken part in many wars together, whether it was in World War I or II or Afghanistan or Gulf Wars, the two Gulf Wars, or in Iraq and all those places. Australia even sent troops to Vietnam, though the British didn't do that. The US helped Great Britain in the Falklands War. TOT for nuclear weapons, missiles, SSNs, SSBNs were given under the 1958 treaty by the US to the UK. That was the only time that the US has shared that kind of technology with anybody. And both are founders of the NATO as well, and the Five Eyes. These three countries have been the staunchest allies during the Cold War 1.0. They have practically a unanimity of view on any geopolitical, geostrategic, geosecurity issue. They voice the same statements in the UN bodies or any other body for that matter. They consult each other very frequently, and their actions are always unanimous. There is no better ally for the US in Europe than the UK. And this is a fact. This is not going to change. Whether Brexit or no Brexit, this is not going to change. Their destinies are tied together. That having been said, the UK has not committed any military to the Indo-Pacific. See, there is a big difference between transferring some technology to Australia and committing military to Indo-Pacific, which it has not done. While the TOT for SSNs is a correct choice by the Biden administration, the AUKUS deal itself might have been hastened by, the AUKUS deal was there for quite some time probably, but it might have been hastened by the sudden loss of prestige in Kabul that the US faced. That is part of the course. That is, there are too many loose ends to be tied up in this mega deal. Who is going to supply the highly enriched uranium? Who is going to supply the nuclear reactor? Of course, it's all going to come from the UK. That's what we understand. How you are going to avoid the IAEA? China is not going to keep quiet. It's going to throw some spanners into the whole works. It's not going to keep quiet. But I do not see a need for raised eyebrows, either from the UK or from India. Of course, Poland has raised an issue with the UK saying, are you interested more in Indo-Pacific now than in Europe? And the UK has clarified that it is not the case. It's as much interested in Europe as it was before. So I do not see a need for raised eyebrows at this point of time, whether from the European Union countries or from India or Japan, for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sridharan. I just have a small question. Going a little bit deeper, do you think, because you have mentioned about Joe Biden in your response, going a little bit deeper, do you think this is a shift in the US policy about finding a new partner in the Indo-Pacific geostrategic space, in this case, which happens to be Australia?
No, absolutely not, Bala. That's not what I think. As others have also mentioned, I think, as Commodore Watson mentioned, AUKUS is complementary to the Quad. Probably we will have some other question where we can clarify that. AUKUS is just an opportunity for the US to increase the capacity. It's actually a capacity building exercise, in my opinion, of increasing the capacity of the Australian Navy to take on China in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia is limited by many factors, like, for example, the range. It is very far away from theaters of operation, so it may require range. So those are the kinds of issues, and this is probably the right opportunity, right time for US to transfer some technology and build up the Australian capacity.
Thank you, sir. Staying on the subject of Europe and their reactions to the announcement, another highlight has obviously been France's reaction and the estrangement of France. Just days after the announcement, there has been talk, both in diplomatic platforms and in think tank circles, of France and India joining hands to share defense technology and establish a truly multilateral world order. Commodore Venugopal, should India capitalize on this occasion and pursue a partnership with France, Or is this merely short-sighted French antics to save a sinking economy?
See, it's not a ready-made answer, which can be given off the cuff. Pursuing a strategic partnership with any country needs a detailed analysis to arrive at a logical conclusion. For a start, we need to have a national security strategy. From it flows the maritime strategy. The maritime strategy should define our area of interest in the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, we do not have a NSS, at least in the public domain. And hence, it is an individual's perception for our area of interest. The area of interest defines the contours of maritime strategy in the region. To me, our area of interest is defined by the sea lanes of communication between Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Aden to Malacca Straits. In this area of interest, we are the first responder to any incident at sea, being the largest navy in the region. A first responder is more of an apt term or a pragmatic phrase to be used than a net security provider, net security facilitator, net security enabler, the three terms which I don't hear much of in the nowadays. But first responder is always a pragmatic view, and based on that, we should consider our area of interest to be in Indian Ocean. Having said that, France has sovereign territories at Adelie Island, Cossette Island, Kerguelen Islands, St. Paul, Amsterdam Islands, and Scattered Islands. The capital at Reunion. You'll be surprised to know that the EEZ of France measures up to 4.5 million square kilometers, almost double that of India. India's EEZ that I'm referring to. Hence, it is in France's interest to keep their strategic objectives in Indian Ocean open, and they would have an intent to be of importance or relevance in the region. Hence, I see a convergence in strategic objectives of France and India to a certain extent. So it would be worthwhile looking at a partnership wherein both countries are benefited. We already have a logistic pact with France signed in 2018. We have a bilateral naval exercise by name Varuna since 2013. We are getting ready to sign a major defense cooperation agreement with France soon. Most importantly, any defense cooperation agreement needs to be within the ambit of our policy of strategic autonomy, and at the same time, it should be devoid of any geopolitical riders. But we need to walk halfway by being reciprocal to France's objectives as well, which means when we are using the facilities at Reunion Island, we should be ready to give our facilities to France when the need arises. Unfortunately, our policy of strategic autonomy at times looks into, I need the thing, but then I'm hesitant to give you because I maintain strategic autonomy. That should go off from our mindset to make good of. Overall, I feel that it would be in our interest, if France is also in the same lines, to have a strategic partnership with France within the contours of our policy of strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Menon, for illustratively putting out what it requires. I have a question for Commodore Garg. Commodore Garg, taken from where you left in your first response, you can see, the regular freedom of navigation operations, which was led by the US and all its allied navies. As you can see, they have neither deterred nor daunted China, because China has still proceeded to create artificial islands. It has went on to convert them into fortified air bases. I would like to quote the Chinese response on one. Within quotes, it said it's a headline grabbing idea which will dissipate like sea foam. So coming from a maritime background, from a maritime point of view, could you please tell us how can China's aggressive and illegal conduct along the Sino-Indian border can be tackled using sea power?
See, from the maritime point of view, China is trying to grab the islands. We just mentioned of so many countries are they're countries with China, correct? We have no island, no boundary as a sea, as a maritime area is concerned with China, correct? Directly, we have friends, we have partnership. But India as a nation, as Komodo Menon said, that you have your own security doctrine. We have right to navigation. We are going. In fact, Ines Erawat had gone to Vietnam. I must like to quote you that example to you. Ines Erawat, we have a LSTL which went for exercise to Vietnam, and when he was around 45 miles of the coast of Vietnam, he was challenged by the Chinese that you are in their waters. And that was the answer of Indian Navy, the young captain, the commander. I have freedom of navigation at international waters, and I am doing that. And he continued with that. That is what Indian Navy that is all about. The freedom of navigation at sea. I'm not being a belligerent to somebody's, but yes, I'm not threatening anybody, but if China threatens me, I have my own ways to tackle it. There's one part of it. You say India's boundary issues. Yes, if we have escalation on the borders, then maritime is going to play a big role. There are ways. The time comes, they'll be played that way.
Thank you, Commodore Garg. Commodore Vasan, would you like to add more depth to what Commodore Garg has said?
I think Commodore Garg has rightly identified the issues related to freedom of navigation, which is the central concept as far as the US, UK, now India and others are concerned. Now we from India have to acknowledge that South China Sea is important to us for our trade, and also which complements the Look East policy of India. So there's a lot of trade that goes through this. And you cannot have people going around objecting to the use of sea lanes of communication, which is part of the United Nations Conventions on Laws of the Seas. To that extent, even a warship can go up to 12 nautical miles of another country, which is what is allowed. So, we see no purpose in China trying to say that, everybody should declare that they are coming into our area. These are obviously designed to see that, they garner more areas, establish control, and finally nobody will be able to challenge them, which is what they've done by creation of artificial islands, converting them into military garrisons, building artificial reefs over which there are runways, which has extended their range of operation. So you have unsinkable carriers in the form of these converted islands. So what China is trying to do is to challenge the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which is why these countries have come together. Now, as far as India's options are concerned, I'm sure we'll discuss this later. But the point is that, like Venu also brought out, if France has an exclusive economic zone, which is as high as it's much more than ours, some figures say it is 2 times, some figures say it's 3 times, it doesn't matter. It's more than what India possesses as exclusive economic zone. And the future of the entire humanity lies in the oceans when it comes to security, stability, prosperity, even for offshore energy, for planktons, for everything else, we need to be now using the oceans. So with that being the case, oceans become the primacy purpose for which people will start working together. The blue economy or sustainable development goals are all part of this initiative to harness the oceans. I'm not saying exploit the oceans, but to harness the oceans in an intelligent manner, which is where, we need to assert our right to harness the oceans around us, not just in the Indian Ocean, but anywhere else, for ease of transportation, trade, and for connectivity. These are something which is going on for centuries. There's nothing today. Today you are talking about the maritime Silk Road, but for generations, for centuries, civilizations have contacted to each other from China to India to Europe through the sea roads as well as the land routes. So this is where we need to protect and ensure that one country does not become a hegemon and challenge what is enshrined in the UNCLOS 1982. I'm sure we'll discuss more on this because I see plenty of questions already in the chat box related to the concept of the FOIP. Over to you, Bala.
Thank you, sir. That was a very comprehensive response. And coming back to the subject of France and Europe, Mr. Sridharan Subramanian, sir, France, the third NATO nuclear armed power after the US and the UK, and the only European nuclear power operating in the Pacific with strategic interests in the region. So according to you, how important is France and Europe's support in the West tackling of China?
Nisha, that's a good question. France is very important to Indo-Pacific and by extension for tackling China. It has important bases, as Commodore Venugopal also said, in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, such as Djibouti, Reunion Island, Mayotte Island, New Caledonia, and was in French Polynesia and in South Pacific. So, and France has the second largest EEZ in the whole world. And as Commodore Venugopal once again said, they have 4.5 million square kilometers in the Indo-Pacific region itself. They totally have about 9 million square kilometers. So they cover the maritime space from the Indian Ocean region to Western Pacific. We have to also remember that in 1884, France defeated China. Chinese Nanyang, naval force, which was called the Southern Naval Force, and liberated Vietnam in just half a day. And this is something that China has not forgotten. Then the French gave the name Indo-China to this region, and we should be grateful to France for giving that name, because that I always want to refer to the South China Sea as Indo-China Sea, because that is the way it should be referred to, in my opinion. So, few months back, I also want to mention that France sent one of its SSNs into the South China Sea or the Indo-China Sea, and after it came back to its base, France openly announced that one of its SSNs has successfully completed a mission in the Indo-China Sea. This is something very unheard of, very unusual, because these kind of missions are never advertised, even after the missions are complete. So that shows that France is itching to be a power in the Pacific region as well. And also, we have to remember that the relationship between France and US is much older than even US and the UK. Because French supported the American colonies that were fighting for American independence against the British. And since the time, the two countries, France and the US, have maintained very close relationship. So, since every country's support is valuable in containing the Chinese aggression and the Chinese threat, the contribution of France, which is a major power in this region, and also a close ally of the US, would also be significant. The German and Dutch naval vessels are also escorting, some of these, battle groups and visits in the Indo-China Sea. So. But they are, as of now, only sideshows. They are not taking great part in the naval exercises or anything of that nature. The rest of the EU countries are not even in the picture. They may be worried more about Russia at this point of time than Indo-Pacific. This is my opinion about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sridharan. I would like to now bring in Commodore Menon. Commodore Menon, yesterday in the Quad Summit, what we saw was a lot of warming up between the Indo-US relationship. In a way, it also brings comfort to India. And there were US offers of help to make India a very great power, declarations that two of the world's great democracies should also have two great militaries, etc. Should this ties, especially with the US, should this be taken with a generous pinch of salt, or do you really think that India's moment has really come? How do you see this in your perspective, Commodore Menon?
See, I think we see too much into these nicely worded diplomatic statements emanating from all over, and we feel proud to be part of it. It's a feel-good factor. So yes, Indo-US relations have been improved considerably since the last 2 decades, beginning with the signing of Indo-US nuclear agreement. Since then, we've been a recipient of high-end military technology from the United States with respect to sophisticated military hardware. Russia was once upon a time the biggest arms supplier to India. Now we have Russia joined by France, US, South Korea, and Israel. One major advantage of following a policy of strategic autonomy. Right. US arms import to Delhi, rather to India, reached 3.2 billion US dollars in 2020, which shows clearly the quantum leap in our arms imports from the United States. However, India's dependence on US arms may face geopolitical riders at a future date, which we cannot negate anytime. Acquisition of S-400 missiles from Russia will be the first test to that effect. Whether this will be countered by the CAATSA Act or not. Geopolitics and international relations is a two-way street. Our policy of strategic autonomy will always face the restrictions, in our path ahead as far as having relations with other countries, especially strategic relations with the military component is concerned. So before we take a plunge and enter into any kind of fixed alliance with the United States or for that matter, any country, we need to be very careful whether it goes away from our foundations of our foreign policy or not. In the absence of a strategic alliance, US will also have its limits in transferring high-end technology. So it's a two-way street. We cannot say that we want everything, but then we will not be your fully allied partner. That may not be acceptable to the other country, which we have to accept. And hence we will face restrictions as we move ahead. For this to fructify or mature into a full-fledged strategic relationship, a lot would depend on the direction of our foreign policy in the coming years, which is the most important fact. Many analysts are of the view that we should shed our policy of strategic autonomy or non-alignment and assume sides in the emerging world order, bipolar world order, with the United States on one side and China on the other. Well, it's a very big topic and the discussion can go on and on. So I will leave that aside for the time being. So I hope I have answered my question without giving you a specific yes or no. That's diplomacy, by the way.
Very much, Commodore Menon. And I agree with you. Diplomacy is telling something explicitly in an implicit manner. May I request Mr. Sridharan, would you like to intervene? Because hearing to the response, we find these words are more like a feel-good factor. How do you see this, Mr. Sridharan? Do you think really India's time has come, or is it still a feel-good factor? Are India's ties with the US?
No, see, I agree with Commodore Menon on that point. Most of the time, we want to have everything, but we don't want to give anything to anybody else. That is not the way, that's not the way international relationships work. So we should be, if we want to have, some great relationship with somebody, we want to have transfer of technology. Even take for example, some of the questions that are being raised in media. Why we have not been given the SSN, technology, even at Prakash or somebody of that stature asked that question. That question cannot be answered, can be answered very easily. We are never an ally of that class as Australia is to the US or to the UK. We never fought with shoulder to shoulder with the US or the UK. Even the UK we have done, but not with the US, right? So we cannot demand anything like that from the US. So it's not a feel-good factor. Of course, now we can take Schadenfreude or take some pleasure out of something, but that's not a feel-good factor. I would say that we have to be equally reciprocating. I would leave it at that.
Thank you, sir. Now let's discuss the reactions of China and Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which have not been very positive. Commodore Vasan, the AUKUS Pact was preceded by Japan and Vietnam signing a defense partnership of their own, the Japan-Vietnam Defense Equipment and Technology Transfer Agreement. Like the AUKUS Pact, the Japan-Vietnam Agreement also prioritizes security in the Indo-Pacific as a chief concern. In your opinion, sir, will the escalating strategic and defense efforts in the Indo-Pacific lead to a potential Cold War 2.0 in the region, as China and some other Southeast Asian countries have warned?
Thank you, Nisha. It's a very, very interesting question, because it relates to, on one hand, the developments in Southeast Asia, particularly in terms of response of the ASEAN as a collective group, and separately the response of individual nations. So this is where your question related to the recent agreement that was signed between Japan and Vietnam becomes very relevant. It only shows that Japan is reaching out to the ASEAN neighbors. It's not just Vietnam. It's helping out Philippines, it's helping out Malaysia, it's helping out Indonesia with military hardware, training efforts, and all that is happening. But why is Vietnam so much more important? If you notice, in the last, let's say about 8 to 9 months, the very first outing of the Japanese Prime Minister was to Vietnam. This has been noted by all of us. Likewise, the very first visit of the Defense Minister from France was also to Vietnam. Why is this so? Why is that Vietnam has become so important? Now, all of us know that it's so Vietnam, being a small country, has given a bloody nose to China. And China has reservations about the way Vietnam would respond to the territorial disputes in South China Sea. So there are major disputes there. And obviously, Japan would like to encourage Vietnam to be the forward post of Japan when the push becomes a shove. So we should look at the nature of the agreement that has been signed between Japan and Vietnam. It's very important. It is the amount of military hardware that will go to Vietnam is important. We must also remind ourselves that when Japan pledged some $2 billion for various companies to move out from China, I know it was Vietnam that was the largest recipient. For something like 20 to 23 of these big companies moved into Vietnam. So that is part of creating an alternate supply chain. So this is where Japan has found that Vietnam would be a very important factor in its future discourse related to Japan-China relations. If Vietnam is affected today at South China Sea, so is Japan in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands. Just 2-3 days ago, you had reports that the Chinese submarines were operating there. It is not the first time that they're doing it, but it's also about signaling and timing. So they know that there is a major quadrilateral summit that's taking place. They know that the announcement has been made related to the AUKUS. And therefore, they would like to send a message, and you will find suddenly increased presence of Chinese PLA units, whether it is submarines or the military militia or anybody, both in the Vietnam exclusive economic zone and the Japanese exclusive economic. So this will continue to be a hotspot in the South China Sea. And as was also brought out earlier, I think by Commodore Girk, Indonesia, also has expressed some concern about the AUKUS, which is the military dimensions. Singapore has openly supported it. And you find that Malaysia is a little wary about the outcome of the AUKUS. Philippines is happy that it's getting a lot more support from Japan. Vietnam, I think, is in a very happy position today because of this contest, because India also has been engaging. We have relations with them at the defense level, at the political level, and at the strategic level. So Vietnam has become central to the responses that are being orchestrated by Japan and by others. So some are happening at a bilateral level, and some are happening at the multilateral level. So this is something that we need to watch to see what is in the open domain as to what all that they're going to engage in as far as the Japan-Vietnam agreements are concerned. Likewise, there are agreements. It's on record that Japan has already given more than 11 frontline units and many other training facilities to the countries in ASEAN. So it's also about shaping an opinion of ASEAN against China, because ASEAN to date is on record has not taken any decision against China. And even if they have discussed behind the doors, they have not come out in the open with a statement that targets China. Except for making very generalized statement. Free and open Indian Pacific, etc., means nothing, because they were countries which are directly affected by the aggressive designs of China in South China Sea, and therefore these developments need to be carefully watched on how Japan is trying to use the existing arrangements to leverage its own capacity, capability for future scenarios. It's all about building something for the future. Even AUKUS, for that matter, is not for tomorrow. It's for something that is, being built up in the next 15 years. So we need to look at this as what kind of options are being exercised by countries to protect their future interests, whether it's in South China Sea or in the East China Sea. Hope I answered some of your questions.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. To conclude, before we move on to the question and answer session, I have a question to all the 4 distinguished panelists. So in the best interest of time, I expect an answer in 60 seconds. Starting from Commodore Garg. Commodore Garg, to conclude this discussion, what do you think are India's policy response from a strategic point of view, being a pilot to forge an alliance or to say coalition in the Indo-Pacific in shoring up our defense against China? Starting from you, Commodore Garg.
See, first, India is not aligned to any of the alliances. India, let's have been said, maintain its strategic autonomy, build up the capacity, friends to all, and we will respond as the time comes to our national interest. China, yes, is a threat in being to us, is a competitor. We have issues with them, but we have nothing against the AUKUS. It doesn't affect us in one way or another. I'll leave it here.
Mr. Sridharan, please, your responses, please.
See, my response is that the strategic ambiguity is not a wise and pleasing approach, because it fools nobody, not least China. Even China knows that after gone that India is more formally entrenched with the Quad. And in terms of AUKUS, I feel that AUKUS is supplementary to complementary to what Quad is, and it's not competitive or it's not taking away the teeth from the Quad. Thank you.
Commodore Menon?
I will go to the basics. That's India to have a national security strategy first, and from where a maritime strategy has to flow out. NSS would identify the threat perceptions. Now, a threat perception in Western Pacific is of no concern to me. Frankly speaking, do we have the wherewithal to go and look at a threat perception in West Pacific or in South China Sea? No. We have to restrict our area of interest based on our threat perception and build up capacity with indigenous efforts, and where it is not available, transfer technology from foreign nations or friendly nations without geopolitical riders. That is most important that we need. And indigenization is the watchword. And if you have a look at South Korea, how they progressed since 1950s to what they are today, it is a glaring example of how indigenization really changes the face of a country. So it might take time, but it has to go on, notwithstanding the obstacles which is faced while implementing it. Meanwhile, we continue to maintain the policy of strategic autonomy based on our national interests, and that has suited us so far, and I hope it will suit us for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Menon. Now it's the turn of Commodore Vasan to fire.
Yeah, okay, 60 seconds. I'm happy that all the 3 panelists before me have given wonderful summing up in those 60 seconds as far as where we stand. Let me be more specific to the recent developments. India has to look at this as an opportunity, whether it is Quad or whether it is a cost, it gives you new windows of opportunity for ensuring that you go on that particular trajectory. So yes, you need to decide what the trajectory is, which is where Commodore Venu's recommendation on having a coherent national security strategy is of great importance. Indigenization is part of it. So I'm personally very happy that recently we placed orders for the LCAs, we placed orders for the Arjun tanks, and there is so much more that is happening in indigenous. Unless you have the capacity and capability, you cannot have an intention to challenge anybody which is there. So I look at this as a golden opportunity for India, because with AUKUS you have stalemated China. He's more worried about what is happening in his neighborhood than in the Indian Ocean region. Not that he's lost interest, but you are making it even more difficult for him to re-optimize his resources in the Indian Ocean region, where he has to fight to protect his illegally acquired territory. So AUKUS and Quad are pressure points which have been applied on China. And for India, I again re-emphasize that it is a golden opportunity for us to look at our options, recalibrate our responses, and choose a track that serves India's national interest for the next. You call it strategic autonomy, you call it NAM 2.0, it doesn't matter to me. Does it serve our long-term national interests? If so, what are these? Define them. And no, it's not that they are static. They'll continue to be dynamic because there are new changes. Nobody expected AUKUS. So you have to respond and react. You can't say, this is my national security strategy, I'll follow this. So it will continue to be influenced by the happenings around us. And that is where our response mechanism, our diplomacy, our the strategic thinkers have to come together to see what these options are. So I look at this as a wonderful time for India to again use the Chinese phrase, bide for time, build your strength. This is the time to bide for time and build your strength, and then everything else will fall into place. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan, and all the 4 distinguished panelists for patiently taking all our questions. Now it is the turn of our distinguished participants to make our distinguished panelists uncomfortable with their questions. My colleague, Ms. Nisha, will now take all the questions from the chat box. Nisha, over to you, Nisha.
Thank you, sir. Our first question is from Mr. Saptarshi Basu, and I'll direct it to Commodore Vasan to begin with. He asks, is there a possibility of technology transfer for nuclear aircraft carrier for other members of the Quad?
Okay, the answer can be a long one, but to cut it short, as you are aware, our own carrier program has taken some time, and we've gone through the conventional way. Even the next carrier that we are talking about, there are a lot of questions about whether it will come through at all. And that is the one which was supposed to be 65,000 tonner with a nuclear propulsion. Now, for a nation which has built a small reactor of 83 kN capacity to put it inside a small submarine of 6,000 ton, it is not going to be a big task for us to put it on a nuclear carrier, provided there is an intention. If there is a political will, this can be made. At that time, if the nation, I have Dr. L.V. Krishnan, who is part of Chennai Center for China Studies, there is a capacity and capability of our Atomic Energy Commission and the nuclear establishment to design something on our own, provided there is a political direction. How did Pokhran happen? How did Arihant come about? So this came about because there was a political will and a direction as to how the nation has to protect its interests and safeguard its interests. So the question, whether you get it from France today or whether it's USA, I'm always very uncomfortable with this proposition to say we should go to Russia or France or USA. Why not make it on our own? How did China come to this position that it's making everything today? It has built something like 360 vessels, which is more than what USA has got. And here there is no foreign collaboration. Of course, they've copied, they've done everything else which is illegal, but the point is that they made it on their own. So what is it that stops India, a country of 1.3 billion, with such scientific capacity to start making things on our own? So I would be the last person to say that we must get people from outside to come and help us in building our carrier. Did we not build this carrier on our own? Did we not build INS Arihant, which has given you a strategic deterrence on our own? So why this hesitation? And why we keep on looking at this? I know there are also people say, no, see now France is out of the deal in Australia. So why don't you get them in? It is the stupidest solution that is being given to India, which would like to stand on its own legs. I would be very uncomfortable just because, yes, we require some collaboration. I'm not against collaboration, but to jump into a solution which is half-bred is something that will not serve our long-term interests of Atmanirbharata. So let's do it on our own, even if it is a little harder way to do it. No pain, no gain.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. Next is a question for Commodore Garg. Commodore Garg, do you see other US allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia assisting Washington in capacity building in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, you have so many relations now amongst the countries in Southeast Asia as such. We have so many bilateral relationships. You just heard the example, which is that Japan is giving so many vessels to other countries. It's building up slowly. And there is no embargo. Any country you can't take help. Yes, Japan is a big country which have technology. South Korea is one. Australia doesn't have a big base that way. But yes, slowly, other countries can be helped as they want. India is one of the big ship makers now. India is giving vessels because of Sri Lanka. We are giving to Malay in IOR regions. So India is the one big shipping industry, and they should come to India, in my personal view.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mr. Sundeep, and I'll ask it to Commodore Menon. He asked, the Quad, AUKUS, and Build Back Better world seem to be a three-pronged approach to counter China. Do we see these three strategies being coordinated and complementary to each other?
In the answer to my first question, I had specifically maintained that AUKUS would complement Quad in the overall strategic aim of containing China. But the coordination part, see, first of all, Quad has to, mature into an alliance to have its own mandate and own narrative. When we change the nomenclature from loosely formed grouping to an alliance, a strategic alliance. It may take time. So only when you have Quad as a well-formed alliance and AUKUS as a well-formed alliance, that we can think in terms of coordination between the two. So as of now, we assume that, or rather we are optimistic that both the efforts will complement the overall security situation in Indo-Pacific region. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Commodore Menon. I would like to now request the intervention of Mr. Sridharan. Mr. Sridharan, there's an interesting question by Colonel Hariharan. He has asked, how do you see the future of India-Russia security cooperation in view of these developments?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because Russia is having a very close relationship with China, and Russia is one of the biggest suppliers of arms and ammunition to Indian armed forces. And recently, Russia has also started collaborating heavily with Pakistan. Of course, it has its own interests in keeping the terrorists from endangering the backyard of Russia, which is the Central Asian republics. China is also claiming parts of Central Asia as its own. So Russia has a problem here. Russia has a problem on the one hand to face Europe and the US, and on the other hand to conserve itself against China's ambitions. So it has a very tough situation ahead of it. So while India should continue to maintain a very, very close relationship, because we cannot afford not to do that, with Russia, Russia has to also have a tight, walk a very tight rope, tight line at this point of time. That's how I see it.
Thank you, sir. The next question is to Commodore Vasan. It's from Avinash, and he asks, post-Afghanistan, can other countries trust America?
Can you repeat that question, please? I couldn't get the question.
After Afghanistan, Can other countries of the world trust America?
Oh, well, this question is not of today's origin. This question has surfaced every now and then as to who is a trusted partner and who is not. So in our own case, particularly in India, the strategic community has been wary of America for a long time. And they felt that, it is America which is looking at cultivating Pakistan when it suited their needs. I know it's now vacating Afghanistan when it's convenient to them. And suddenly it is now upset the cartel in the Indo-Pacific by being a partner with Australia for nuclear weapons. So the question is relevant, but I don't worry too much about this question for one simple reason. If America thinks it's America first that serves its long-term objective, for India it should be India first. So there are areas in which we will gain by a certain cooperation, and there are areas in which we need to have a cautious approach. So, for example, the nuclear cooperation with America is not today's. It happened in the previous regime. We are talking about something like 15 years. But what has come out of that? At that time, it was said, the GE reactors would be provided, and therefore America had taken a lot of initiative to, have you in the nuclear supply group, and all those things were there. But the point is that whatever America does is to serve its long-term interest. In the case of the US, UK, which is trying to help out Australia, it is about sustaining its military-industrial complex. So, likewise, India should worry about what its national interests are, what its long-term interests are, what its short-term interests are. Related to this is the previous question. How much should you trust Russia? I would say, going by the experience of last 7 decades, they've been extremely reliable. Even the case of the trans-Himalayan aggression, remember that our own Raksha Mantri traveled to Russia, and whatever was pending was immediately delivered to India, in terms of critical military hardware. So, I think we should be very clear that every nation will continue to serve its own national interest and not yours. It will serve your national interest if it also serves its own national interest. So, I think we should be very clear in our mind and don't expect people to be, unless there is a security pact, like the famous Indo-Soviet pact which was there before liberation of Bangladesh, where any direct attack on India would get the Soviet on your side. Do you have a security pact of that nature? In the case of Taiwan, it has such a security pact with USA. So I think we should be very wise to accept the harsh reality of power dynamics in the global order and choose what is beneficial to you, reject what is not. That is where political acumenship comes in. So I hope you answered that. So we should not be worried about can we trust Russia. We should not be trusting anybody. The Russians have a wonderful saying. Yeah, veryu nu praveryayu. The translation of this is that I trust but I verify. So it's true even in the case of our relations. I trust but I verify. Has he delivered? Out of 10 agreements, has he delivered on 8? Which means he becomes a trustworthy partner. Or has he reneged on 8 of them and only delivered 2? Then he is not a trustworthy partner. So I'm sure there are metrics which are available to assess whether a particular relation, whether it is Quad, whether it is SCO, or whether it is SAARC, has delivered and has it served your long-term interests. If not, there would perhaps be a time when you have to abandon it. Why, like we've done in the case of SAARC, it has not helped us. So therefore, if there is any alliance or an agreement that is detrimental to your interest, you should duck it. So let's not blame somebody else for your own failures of assessment of a situation. We should be very clear that you have chosen something, whether it's a nuclear supplier group or whether it is Quad or whether it is something else. We need to be clear as to what benefits there are. In the terms of Quad and AUKUS, I find there are a lot of benefits for India because it keeps China at bay. Does it serve your interest? Yes, it gives you the time. That's what I meant even in an earlier response to say that if it's given you some time, let's use this to our advantage and not worry about who's trustworthy or not, while you should be conscious of that factor. Make your own assessments. I'm sure people in Delhi are capable of making the judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. Commodore Garg, there's a question for you from Mr. Basu. He has asked, can we have multinational naval bases in the Andaman and Nicobar and Lakshadweep Island to counteract the Coco Island?
Well, first, why do you need the multinational people to come and help us? The Chinese are looking at Coco Island, and with the help of Myanmar, if I say so directly, Indian Navy or the Indian Armed Forces at the Andaman Nicobar, all three services have full capability as on date to take on what is required any day, any time. You have the surveillance capability of 24/7 there now. You got Dorniers, you got PATI, which are around the year, around the clock there on the surveillance. You have ships there, ships with helicopters now. You can go as close as possible. You have submarines are there on the East Coast. So I don't see any region, any thought why should we ask other navies to come and help us out. We are the regional power. We should be going out rather asking us people to help us out. Please remember, Andaman Nicobar is a command now. It's an integrated command, and it's gonna. Yes, you may say not many forces are there, but they can be moved the day you want it. I've been there. When tsunami came over, say 48 hours, everybody was there. But today that is not the case. You got all airstrips are fully commissioned now. From Indira Point to Diglipur to Port Blair to Kardi to Car Nicobar, all airstrips are fully operational. You name the aircraft which can operate from there. You name the ship can go there. Submarines can go there. They can berth there. So why do you need anybody else? So we have full capability, full authority of the area. And I don't think anybody else has to come there. When you look that side, our area, we are the dominance, we are the power there. So I don't see any reason.
Thank you, Commodore Garg. Speaking of submarines, there's one question by Mr. Douglas D'Souza. He has asked, are nuclear-powered submarines as large a threat as nuclear-armed submarines? Your response, Commodore Garg?
Okay. See, the nuclear-powered submarine, which we call SSN, means only the propulsion in nuclear. This is what the France has been offered. Sorry, the Australia have been offered. They will have a nuclear-powered submarine, but they will not have nuclear missiles. They won't have SLBMs. They will have your Tomahawk missiles or torpedoes. So that is your conventional called SSN, nuclear attack submarines. But when we talk nuclear armed submarines, means you are nuclear powered as well as you're carrying the nuclear type missiles or SLBMs. There's a basic difference. Now you can appreciate a nuclear submarine which has long endurance, which has a long reach, and also carrying a nuclear missile, which is a long-range missile, versus a nuclear submarine has a long endurance, but you have a limited range missile, which is against the ships or a torpedo against the ship. So you can see, of course, the nuclear armed submarine with propulsion as well as the nuclear long-range missiles are the strategic assets. And they are much more powerful than the SSNs, which are nuclear powered submarine and will be using against the tactical targets. I hope it made it clear.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. L.V. Krishnan, and he asked two questions. Mr. Sridharan, I'll be asking questions to you, sir. The first question is, can we rule out US nuclear submarines being leased out to Australia in the very near future? And the second question is, North Korea has more submarines than Russia. Do we foresee China instigating North Korea to increase its submarine movements in the South China Sea and perhaps encouraging it to go for nuclear submarines?
The first question was regarding, I couldn't hear that properly.
Yes, I'll just repeat it. The first question was, can we rule out US nuclear submarines being leased out to Australia in the very near future?
I don't think the US will ever lease or give any submarine to any other country, even those countries which are joined at the hip. So I don't think that possibility arising at all, especially with Australia. The second question was about North Korea having submarines and China in North Korea to use those submarines in the Indo-China Sea. Is that what?
Yes,
was that
sir.
the question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So see, with China, nothing is nothing can be predicted. And China and North Korea are very close. Just like being the US and the UK being joined at the hips, China and North Korea are also joined at the hips. North Korea is not surviving without the help of China at all. And North Korea is not doing all those missiles and nuclear tests without the total support of China. So North Korea will be, indebted to China for its survival. So North Korea can be easily forced into taking actions that support China at any point of time. So that is not a possibility that can be ruled out either.
Nisha, may I just add in this?
Sure, sir.
Yeah, the first part of the question is like when a nation, a country doesn't have a nuclear submarine, they know how to operate it. Give a technology to you, like India started. So we had a nuclear submarine on lease, on twice. Our crew got trained, and now I won't say we are master, but we are quite confident handling it now. But I agree with Sridhar sir, US may not do this. US is what it is. Give it back.
Can I add something, Nisha, in this?
Sir, thank you. May I request your intervention after Commodore Garg finishes, sir, please?
Okay. So what may happen, because it's a collaboration between US and UK for the Australia. And what is everybody looking at is, it is the UK submarine, the British submarine design, which may come to Australia, which propulsion coming from US. So could be they may train with UK, which is much more open than the US. This is my outlook looks like. Menon sir?
What I'd like to add here is that, assistance finally coming out of Australian shipyard, or, is going to take at least a decade plus, most probably 2035 or so. In the interim, it is possible that the US nuclear submarines could operate from the Australian ports. It may not be ballistic missile submarines, but definitely SSNs, ballistic missile submarines, due to the fact that it violates NPT norms of Australia. At the same time, even New Zealand is also wary of having nuclear boats operating in the area. My submission. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bala, just one thing I would like to add to the two other naval officers who brought out very pertinent points. On the issue of a nuclear submarine operating out of Australian port, as Commodore Venu has brought out, obviously the US nuclear submarines will have bases in Australia or anywhere else which is required. New Zealand is out of question. And like Commodore Garg has brought out, Australia will perhaps choose the same course that India opted for, which is to lease a nuclear submarine, which is what we did from Russia. So they will do perhaps likewise from UK, because it serves not only the commercial interest, but if you want Australia to be a reliable partner for the future, you'd rather train them. It's pointless suddenly give them a boat and say go and operate it. So it will take considerable amount of time for them to become a capable navy which can handle nuclear submarines. So from that point of view, I would go along with both Garg and Venu, where I have no doubts that the future, as they are firming up their options, will also see some kind of a leasing out option which will not be off the table. So this is how navies operate, because you are looking at a professional component of the nuclear component, which will form perhaps later, which will also graduate to the SSBS, depending on how the situation develops in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Basan. Mr. Sridharan, there's a question from Colonel Hariharan. He has asked, we should not forget that the Chinese migrants to Australia outnumber Indians. And Victoria had joined the Belt and Road Initiative till the present government came and dismantled it. Can Australia now revert back to closer relations with China, or can it avoid it in a democratic setup? Would you like to respond to this?
See, the Victorian Belt and Road Initiative violated some of the Australian laws, and these laws were promulgated to prevent the interference and influence of foreign countries into Australian domestic politics. And that was why one of these, some of these BRA projects were struck down. So Victoria is not going to implement any of those BRA projects anytime at all. So this is not going to happen. In fact, there has been other cases where Chinese influence through Chinese origin Australians have been, found goods and they have been arrested, and the trials going on. So that's a big, Chinese influence trying to, change the shape of politics in Australia, and that is being changed. There have been at least 3 laws that have been enacted by Canberra to overcome these problems, and these are not going. China is not going to find it easy at all to influence Australia in any way in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Sridharan. Before we conclude this debate, on any final words on this from Commodore Vasan? In 30 seconds, please, in the best interest of
Bala, if there are no unanswered questions, with the permission of the audience, we could extend it by another 10 minutes in case there are some more questions which have not been answered. Because I see there is a large number of people and there have been many questions. I do not mind if other panelists are okay with that to extend this by another 10 to 15 minutes. I'll leave it to you.
Would you like to respond to this, Commodore Vasan, with regard to the Australian question posed by Colonel Hariharan?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Colonel Hariharan has asked, we should not forget that the Chinese migrants to Australia outnumber the Indians. And Australia joined the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the present government came and dismantled it. Now, do you think Australia can revert back to forge closer relations with China, or can it avoid it in a democratic setup?
No. From all the indications that are there, I would go along with the response given by Sridharan, that I do not foresee a revival of BRI. Whether there are greater number of Chinese in Australia or not, the point is they already reached the point of no return, because they've tried to put economic pressure, they've stopped the import of beef, they've tried to put pressure through economic means, to political means, through diplomatic means, and they made it very uncomfortable for Australians. So there is an element of national pride, and Australians, like anybody else, are also very proud people, and they would not like to be snubbed. And it has happened, where Chinese officials have even barged into some conferences and they've tried to say that Australia is doing this wrong. So I don't think any country which is self-respecting will accept this kind of an intrusion in the way it shapes its responses to the BRI or investments or whatever. So I do not see a great revival of BRI as such. On the contrary, because of the Blue.net, because of the new surplus funds that are being created, and also the initiative of Joe Biden related to B3W, that is better world, back to better world. So these are the concepts which are there, so which are being floated. So therefore, I am sure that people will start looking at alternatives that are available, which are more benign in nature and not predatory as is being offered by China. I have no doubts about it. So I don't see too much of a revival as far as the BRI projects in Australia is concerned, or for that matter, even many other countries which have shunned BRI now.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. Commodore Menon, there's a question by Ms. Ulsi Tawari. She has asked, for the US, it is 100% containing China issue. If this corollary or this proposition is to be, yes, it's true, then the Quad becoming a broad-based subject like science and technology, cyber security, etc., is true, or just a diplomatic facade for military positioning? Your views on this, please, Commodore Menon.
It's a very complicated question to start with. As I mentioned, Quad started off, or rather the Quad initiative was proposed by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007. Thereafter, within a year, there was no consensus, and it was literally a died down kind of alliance till 2018, when President Trump revived it. And so it is a step-by-step process as far as Quad is concerned. If you recall the last joint statement after the Quad meeting, that is the virtual meeting, it contained only climate change, technology transfer, COVID vaccine, and post-COVID supply chain. But now, when you see the current statement at the end of the day, after the last in-person Quad summit, you will see that the scope is widened. So that means slowly the members are getting on board. So for any strategic alliance to actually come into a security dimension will take time, because security dimension is dictated by geopolitical reasons as well. And for example, for India to take a call on the security dimension of Quad, it will take some time because China is our immediate neighbor. And diplomatically, we may not like to come into a kind of a confrontation with them, or rather to heighten the land border tension which is already existing. Similarly, Japan will also be a little careful because of the Senkaku Islands issue. So now these two countries will actually determine, India and Japan will determine in a way the path of Quad towards fructifying into a security pact. And in India's case, it will be a paradigm shift in our foreign policy, because time and again our external affairs minister had clearly stated that India does not form part of any alliance. So unless and until there's a political will at New Delhi, can India stand, or Japan's pacifist constitution amendments back them into joining a security alliance of this nature to counter China? So it's actually a work in progress, if you ask, as far as security dimension of Quad is concerned. But at the same time, Quad is slowly shaping up, in the sense the agenda is increasing, the canvas is broadening. Like as Commodore Vasan said, subtly it is giving a message to China. That is the intent. The basic intent is to give a message to China that yes, Indo-Pacific is not your hegemonic domain. There will be a counter, and this counter will slowly shape up. So this is the answer which one can give at the moment as far as Quad is concerned, considering the present circumstances and the present geopolitical dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The last question for today, I'll just bring back Mr. Sandeep's question to Mr. Sridharan. His first question was, if the Quad, AUKUS, and Build Back Better world seem to be a three-pronged approach to counter China, do we see these three strategies being coordinated and complementary to each other? And sir, if you could highlight how the Build Back Better world complements AUKUS and Quad, that would be useful.
See, one of the main reasons that China has gained foothold in all parts of the world is through connectivity, and by setting up infrastructure projects. Maybe it emanated from the fact that China had oversupply of construction material and workforce and all those kinds of things. But eventually, these two major components gained a lot of foothold for China in various parts of the world. And so, in order to counter that, US has to do something about this. In fact, Japan and India had also started, Asia Growth Corridor and stuff like that. They were all meant for similar reasons as well. So with China, with the US taking the plunge into this kind of activity, I think that will be a counter to China in that kind of sphere, not only military sphere, but also in this kind of sphere. So that's a very welcome move that has to be, that will counter China.
Thank you, Mr. Sridharan. Like all good things come to an end. This serious debate should also conclude now and has to come to an end. In all the responses from our distinguished panelists, what we can see is that the partnership is going to be more beneficial for India, and it is also going to act or rally a broader coalition of countries in the Indo-Pacific region. It shall not only upgrade India's allies in the region, but also provide the necessary time to build our own maritime capabilities, as even Commodore Vasan has got the Chinese maxim, hide your strength and bide your time. It was indeed an illuminating debate with fruitful exchanges between the distinguished panelists. We thank all the distinguished panelists, starting from Commodore R.S. Vasan, Director General C3S, Commodore Vijesh Kumar Garg, Executive Director C3S, Commodore Venugopal Menon, Distinguished Member C3S, and Shri Sridharan Subramaniam, Distinguished Member C3S, for taking your valuable time to be with us today. We also thank the audience for their participation in large numbers and for posing very pertinent questions. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to my co-host, Ms. Nisha Rebecca Eapen, Research Officer. Thank you again with another interesting topic of debate. Thank you all once again. Signing off, this is Lal Subramanian, Senior Research Officer, on behalf of.
Thank you very much.
Jai Hind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.